Welcome aboard, mates. I'm glad to see you all made it back safely, and at least I hope most of you made it back safely. So let's set sail for the Caribbean. The golden age of piracy. I place those years between 1630 and 1722. And last week, we talked about the Spanish Main being the Caribbean, and it was called the Spanish Main mainly because it belonged to Spain. We also talked about the rise of the buccaneers on the island of Hispaniola, which is today the Dominican Republic and Haiti, and how they got their name from making boucan, which is smoked barbecue. We also talked about letters of marque and the difference between a pirate and a privateer. Privateers are legal, with letters of marque allowing them to attack ships, whereas pirates are illegal completely. And we talked about the origin of pirate flags, major pirate ports of Port Royal and Tortuga. Of course, William Dampier, the buccaneer author, and the pirates of the Indian Ocean, how everything shifted in the 1690s to the Indian Ocean. Of course, we couldn't have a pirate show without Henry Morgan and Captain Kidd. Now, let's set sail for the next phase of the golden age of piracy. In 1702, a war broke out called the War for the Spanish Succession. It's kind of a war that most people don't know about. I mean, when you were kids, you never said, let's go out in the backyard and play War for the Spanish Succession. But yet, it was a very important war and probably the first world war. And it really was over who got to be the new king of Spain. When Charles II died without any heirs, there were two people that were up for the throne. Philip, who was the grandson of King Louis XIV of France, and Charles of Austria, who was the son of the Archduke of Austria and a relative to all of the German rulers. So obviously, whoever got to be the rightful king of Spain, the balance of power would tremendously shift in Europe, and each side wanted their man installed. Now, on the main continent, the war was fought with huge armies, marching all through Europe in large formations, 100,000 troops in each engagement. It was also fought at sea with large navies in immense naval battles where dozens of ships would sink. Now, about the same time the war began, Queen Anne became the new ruler of England and Britain when William and Mary died of natural causes. And because she was the queen during the War for the Spanish Succession, in the colonies, the war was known as Queen Anne's War. Now, the major engagements in the colonies, the first was when all of the sailors from Charlestown came down and attacked St. Augustine in 1702, right at the beginning of the war. And then in 1706, the Spanish retaliated from Cuba, attacking Charlestown. But other than small raiding parties along the coast, those were the only major engagements of the war. But it did see the islands of the Bahamas becoming established as the new ports for all of the privateers now operating within the war. This war was fought at sea with an enormous amount of privateers. As you recall, privateers are legal, but they don't cost the government anything. So when a country wants to expand from a peacetime navy to a wartime navy, they simply issue letters of marque to any honest or dishonest seaman that might want them. And then their navy immediately becomes immense. Letters of marque are cheap. They don't have to pay salaries. They don't have to pay for the ships. And they get 25% of the take. There were 128 privateer letters of marque issued in Bristol, England alone. That just shows you how many privateers were involved in this war. Now, one of the most famous was a man named Woodes Rogers. He was an honest seaman that decided, I'm going to take advantage of these letters of marque, and in 1706 accepted them and sailed from Portsmouth with 2 ships. He sailed around Cape Horn and then up into the Pacific, but he stopped off for water at Juan Fernandez Island. That was an interesting stopover for him because he found a man that had been marooned there by pirates a dozen years ago. He had been living on the island by himself, trying to make a living, and of course, Woodes Rogers took him on board. Later, when they returned to England, this man named Alexander Selkirk told his story to a famous author named Daniel Defoe, who wrote it down in the book Robinson Crusoe. Now, Woodes Rogers continued on up the coast and took the city of Guayaquil, which was a major port in what is today Chile. And then from there, he sailed and waited for the Spanish treasure ship to arrive. As you recall, Spanish treasure fleets came in from the Pacific throughout the year, and many of them either headed to Guayaquil or to Panama. So he positioned his ship where he could get them wherever they came in. And sure enough, soon he sighted one. But the ship saw him and immediately came about and tried to escape. Woodes Rogers pursued, but he realized, being the good seaman that he was, that it would take about 6 hours to catch the ship. What are you going to do for 6 hours? So Woodes Rogers ordered the favorite drink of pirates to be made, hot chocolate. Yes, hot chocolate was the #1 drink among pirates, contrary to popular belief. They would make it in a large vat. And he actually wrote a book about his adventures where he described the incident. I ordered a large block of chocolate to be made for the ship's company. Well, eventually the war was over in 1713. And then you had two major events that took place that would change and shape the lives of the pirates for all time. The first major event took place in 1714. The second one took place a year later in 1715. Now, in 1714, Queen Anne, who was very beloved among the English people and a terrific ruler, died of natural causes with no living children. And King George I became King of England. And this created a major problem for the English people. Now, before I tell you why, I've got to recap a little bit of history with the rulers of England going back before that. As you may recall, James II was King of England from 1685 to 1688. And he had two daughters, Mary Stuart, Anne Stuart, and a son named James Stuart. But James II, obviously his last name was Stuart also, was a bad king. And when he became Catholic, he was kicked out of England along with his young son, who was also a Catholic. And Mary became Queen of England with her husband, William and Mary. When they died, Anne became queen. But when she died, what would happen with his son, James Edward Stuart? Would he take over the title as king? The English people said no. We do not want a Catholic ruler. So they looked to someone else. Now let's go back a couple of generations. You'll see James I way up at the top. He took over as the first Stuart King of England when Queen Elizabeth died. Then he had a son, Charles I, and then a grandson, Charles II and James II, and then their sons, William and Mary, blah, blah, blah. You know that. But Charles I's sister, Elizabeth, married into the German aristocracy, and her grandson was George of Hanover. So when they disavowed King James, that left George. The problem is, George wasn't English, he was German, didn't speak English, had never been to England. And many of the Scots felt, you don't really have the right to give away the King of Scotland as well, because the King of England was also the King of Scotland. So they had what they called the Jacobite Rebellion. Jacobite is Latin for James. Jacob is Latin for James. So the people that were revolting in favor of James were Jacobites. And all of Scotland went to war with England. They launched large forces and large armies into England, but they were defeated, somewhat bloodily. But what about in England? How did the English people feel? Well, the press of the day would tell you this was simply the Scots that were revolting. Those evil Scots, they were always difficult to manage. But in reality, a great many Englishmen were very upset at the selection of King George II. One of them was Admiral George Cammock. He was the senior naval officer in the Royal Navy at the time. He was so upset, he resigned his commission and went and accepted the commission as an admiral in the Spanish Navy to fight the English. Same thing with the Duke of Ormond, who was the senior military leader among the British Army, hero during the War for the Spanish Succession. But he also resigned his commission and went and fought for the Spanish against England. So there are a great many Englishmen that were revolting against King George II. What about the pirates? You figure I'd have to tie in pirates at some point. Yes, many pirates were supporters of King George. In fact, that's why many of them became pirates, because they were supporting the Jacobite Revolution and were hoping to raise funds for it at the beginning of their pirate careers. How do we know this? Easy. There's James Edward Stuart living in exile in France. And he had several nicknames: Prince Cross the Sea, the Pretender, Royal James, and even James III. Well, you'll see a lot of those names appear in pirate ships. But the most famous was the Queen Anne's Revenge. Yes, Blackbeard's ship. Queen Anne was the last of the Stuart monarchs. Why name your ship after the last Stuart monarch in England? That was a sign that he was actually supporting the Jacobite Revolution and James Edward Stuart. In the Caribbean, the governor of Jamaica was Archibald Hamilton, and he was far more than just the governor of Jamaica. He was governor of all of the English territories in the Caribbean, and he was of Scottish ancestry and secretly a Jacobite supporter. So he came up with a plan to use pirates to help fund the revolution back in Scotland. Well, money wasn't going too good until 1715, and that's the second major event that occurred that made piracy possible: the Spanish treasure fleet sinking. You see, Spain had withheld transportation of all of its treasure for 10 years, afraid that the English may take the Spanish treasure ships. But treasure kept piling up in Havana. You can imagine how much treasure was in the warehouses in Havana. 10 years worth of Spanish treasure accumulated from everywhere within their domain, all in several warehouses on the ports of the Havana docks. They loaded them all up into 10 ships and sailed through the Straits of Florida in late July 1715. Well, what happens in Florida in July? Hurricanes. And the ship ran right into one of the largest hurricanes recorded thus far, and all of the ships sank off the Florida coast. It was on a stretch of islands basically from St. Lucie to Melbourne, and all of the ships sank about 10 yards off the beach, so that you could actually walk over to the shipwrecks and recover a lot of treasure with only getting your knees wet. The Spanish set up salvage camps all along the beach to try and recover as much of the treasure as they possibly could. Well, word of the Spanish treasure fleet sinking got out, and everyone wanted to flock to Florida to take advantage of all of this treasure. Archibald Hamilton saw this as the key to setting up a pirate base. So he sent a former privateer named Henry Jennings with letters of marque to attack the Spanish treasure fleet salvage operations. He sent them to San Sebastian Inlet to take as much as he could. This is actually a photograph that I took of the exact spot where Henry Jennings landed on San Sebastian Inlet. Today, there is a terrific museum there that documents the sinking of the Spanish treasure fleet. I highly recommend you get there if you're ever on the east coast of Florida. So he calmly walked up the beach with 300 pirates and took everything that they had salvaged so far. They reckoned about 60,000 pieces of eight. Then he came back a few months later and did the same thing again and walked away this time with about 300,000 pieces of eight. He returned to the Bahamas, but instead of sharing the treasure and building a secret Jacobite base with Archibald Hamilton, as had been planned, Jennings decided to keep it all for himself. He's a pirate. So what about Archibald Henderson? They found out his plan and he was arrested and taken back to London to stand trial for treason. But apparently he was a good talker, because not only did he talk his way out of that situation, but he served the next 34 years in Parliament. So that leaves Henry Jennings in the Bahamas. The name of the island he settled on was the island of New Providence. And the main city on the island of New Providence was Nassau, the same Nassau that exists today. And he had a base on the north shore of Nassau. That's an artist's conception of what it must have looked like about the time Henry Jennings got there. But he was no fool. He decided not to use the money to return to piracy, but to use the money to take money from pirates. How do you do that? He used his money to build taverns, brothels, gambling houses, and warehouses where pirates could buy ammunition, guns, ship stores, anything they needed. So the pirates would return to Nassau, because that was their new pirate base, and spend their money in Henry Jennings' establishments. He became so rich that a couple of years later, he left Nassau and built a plantation for himself in Bermuda and lived happily ever after. Now, the pirates were back with a fully operational pirate base to sail from. This brings us to one of those pirates, the famous Blackbeard. Now, most people hear stories about Blackbeard that he tortured and killed most of his captives, that he sank all the prize ships that he took, that he married 14 times. In fact, the story goes that each time he finished with one of his wives, normally after the wedding night, he would give her to the crew. And when the crew finished with her, they'd throw her overboard, and hopefully they were close enough to shore where she could swim. That he stayed mostly in the waters of the Caribbean, that he was the most feared pirate on the seas for many years, and that he was feared by his crew, often killing his own crew members for the slightest misdeed. None of that is true. Here's the truth. He actually didn't torture any of his captives. He was actually a rather kind captain to almost everyone he took. In fact, there is no documentation that Blackbeard killed anyone until the day he died when he was fighting for his life. Out of all the prize ships he took, he would almost always let people go, either in the ship they had, or he'd keep their ship and give him one of his old ones. There is only one ship that he sank, and that's because they ran from him, jumped overboard, and left their ship abandoned. He was never married, but there is documentation that he had one girlfriend that lived just outside of Philadelphia. Blackbeard's most famous actions were out of the Caribbean. In fact, his first major engagement as a pirate captain was at Cape May, New Jersey. His second major engagement was Charlestown, South Carolina, and he finished up in North Carolina. Beard pirate for many years? Hardly. The entire time he was a pirate captain was only 10 months long. And he was a very good captain to his crew, which remained loyal. In fact, he was an equal opportunity employer. So, where do all of these stories come from? One book, A General History of the Robberies and Murderers of the Most Notorious Pirates, written by a man named Captain Charles Johnson. No one really knows who Captain Charles Johnson was. It is a belief that he is either Nathaniel Mist or Daniel Defoe. Nathaniel Mist was a publisher at the time that ran kind of a tabloid sheet on pirates, and it was believed that perhaps he wanted to upscale to a full-scale book. At any rate, one of his friends was Daniel Defoe. In fact, Nathaniel Mist was the man that published Daniel Defoe's novel, Robinson Crusoe. In any event, one of these two men wrote this book. And it didn't have too many horrible stories about Blackbeard. I mean, the wives weren't in there, the killing of captives, and the book didn't sell very well. So the first edition that came out in 1724, before I continue on, there's only one picture in that first edition, and that picture is of Blackbeard. There he is himself. That big hat he's wearing is actually made out of wool, and those were called Monmouth caps, which were very common among sailors. Keep your head warm at sea, it does. Well, a second edition came out just a few months later, called A General History of the Pirates, from their rise and settlement in the island of Providence to the present time, with the remarkable actions and adventures of the two female pirates, Mary Read and Anne Bonny. Boy, that's some title, isn't it? Could you mind trying to put that on a card catalog? Well, the second edition is where all of the blood-curdling stories appeared. Blackbeard killing people, the 14 wives, everything else. Charles Johnson, whoever he was not writing a history book. He was writing a bestseller. And people wanted stories about pirates. And the more blood-curdling the stories were, the more his book sold. Unfortunately, historians have taken this book as fact and have retold the stories for 300 years as if they were absolutely true. He has three pictures in the second version. One of them is Blackbeard with a more traditional hat. One of them is Black Bart Roberts. And Anne Bonny and Mary Read, the first two female pirates well documented during this time period. Now take a look at how they appear in the English version. The Dutch were a little bit more racy, if you know what I mean. That's the Dutch version that came out the same year. Okay, general history of pirates. We are going to talk about the embellishments, the myths, sensationalism, and the truths that are in this book. And to get to that, let's just get right to Blackbeard, the real Blackbeard, known as Edward Teach. The first time he was ever mentioned was in a letter sent by Captain Matthew Mewson, who was sent as kind of a spy in 1717 to see what was going on in Nassau. And he lists Edward Thatch for the very first time in his letter, along with a man named Benjamin Hornigold, both of whom will play very prominently in the next adventure of the pirates. Notice he spells the name Thatch. We'll talk about that a little later too. Now, Ben Hornigold was considered the master of all privateers. He was probably one of the most experienced and valued privateers in the last war, operating out of Nassau. He had several small plantations where he grew pineapples and had trade with Jamaica and Charlestown and a lot of other areas. But he was foremost a privateer and a great person to study under if one was going to become a privateer too. In 1716, sailing with Ben Hornigold, he did his usual route, circling the island of Cuba, taking prizes as he went. Somewhere south of Cuba, they met another couple of pirates, a man named Sam Bellamy, and another French privateer, recently turned pirate, named Labousse. And they formed a partnership, seeing the mutual advantage of all of them sailing together. They took 41 prizes in a matter of 1 month. Then, just to the east of Cuba, they sighted an English ship. Well, Ben Hornigold, even though he was a pirate, was still loyal to England, and he refused to take part in attacking an English ship. So there was a mutiny, and Ben Hornigold and anyone that wanted to go with him which was about 15 people, were allowed to leave in a small craft without any treasure, by the way. One of those men that left with Hornigold was Blackbeard. So, what about Sam Bellamy? He actually called himself Robin Hood's merry men. He saw himself more as a steal from the rich, give to the poor kind of guy. Very nice pirate, friendly to everyone. The fact that he never actually gave any money away to the poor doesn't really have anything to do with it. He had the spirit of Robin Hood anyway, and that's what counts. Now, just north of the Lesser Antilles, he took a slave ship called the Witta in October 1760. That was a huge ship. That was the prize and the biggest pirate ship in the Caribbean at the time. And then he sailed to Cape Cod to visit his fiancée. He was originally from Cape Cod. Well, when he got there, a nor'easter hit, and the entire ship capsized just off the shores of Cape Cod. All the crew were killed except 8 that managed to swim ashore, and they were captured and hanged shortly afterwards. Now, for 267 years, no one ever bothered to look for that sunken ship, even though local legend says for the first 10 or 20 years, they could still see the mast sticking out of the water. But no one bothered to check the ship and see if there was any treasure on board until 1984, when Barry Clifford and his partner found the wreck and discovered everything that was on board. They set up a Witta museum with a lot of the artifacts. Now, how much did they find? $400 million in today's money, which they got to keep a large portion of. But what's more interesting is they found sacks with a lot of the money already divvied up, as if to give the shares to the crew. And each sack had in it what would be equivalent to about $3 million today, which means that his ship had you could make about $3 million in about 6 or 7 months' work as a pirate. Not bad wages. So Blackbeard and Hornigold were sailing in again, making the loop all the way around the Caribbean. And then they sailed north to Accomack, Virginia. Now, as you recall from last class, Accomack was a spot where pirates often would go to careen their vessel. Careening is pulling the entire ship up on the beach and cleaning it, all barnacles, seaweed, everything else that grows. And in order to do that, you need a safe beach, a quiet beach where you wouldn't be disturbed. And the locals at Accomack made their beach the ideal spot for careening. They would keep the authorities away, provide the crews with food, wine, rum, supplies, anything they needed, and were well paid for it. Blackbeard and Hornigold were careening off of Accomack. One more thing I want to mention, a couple of interesting things. There is a creek called Blackbeard's Creek on Accomack, theoretically where Blackbeard careened a ship. And there's a marina there that I'm quite certain sells a Blackbeard burger. But there is another mention on maps for the next 100 years, refers to a small island as Teach's Key. So apparently the locals did know that Blackbeard was at Accomack in 1717. Now let's take our attention down to Barbados and a man by the name of Stede Bonnet. Stede Bonnet was a plantation owner, wife and family man, major in the local militia, and suddenly he bought a small sloop, fitted it out with a pirate crew, sailed to Accomack where he met up with Blackbeard, gave Blackbeard command of his ship, and started a partnership. Seems very odd to me. We'll talk a little bit about that later on. Blackbeard and Stede Bonnet. According to Charles Johnson, Stede Bonnet just decided, I'm tired of being a plantation owner. I'd like a little adventure in my life. I'm going to become a pirate. And by chance met Blackbeard somewhere at sea, perhaps in Nassau, perhaps at Accomac, and said, I really don't know much about being a sea captain. Would you mind teaching me while you command my vessel? And Blackbeard said, certainly, I'd be glad to take over your ship. That explanation always troubled me. It just doesn't make logical sense. And as we shall see a little later on, the truth might be far different than that fluffy story is told by Charles Johnson. But at any rate, his sloop was a Jamaica sloop which he named the Revenge. Probably had 12 guns and a crew of about 70. And a flag is necessary, and there is Blackbeard's flag. You'll notice the skeleton with a spear pointing at a bleeding heart, holding an hourglass, as if to say, your time is running out. Very impressive and unique flag. So Blackbeard and Bonnet started off their career together in September of 1717. The first thing they did is sail down to Virginia, where they took one ship, but then they sailed right back to Cape May, which is the entrance to eventually Philadelphia. At Cape May, in about a 2-week time period, they captured 20 prizes. That's an astounding amount. You think about that, that's 2 or 3 a day. And since it took them a while to unload all the treasure from each ship, they must have been very busy pirates. Now, an interesting article came out from the Boston Newsletter that gives us a tremendous glimpse into Blackbeard. Arrived Captain Cod from Liverpool, and he talks about the pirate sloop called Revenge of 12 guns and 150 men, commanded by one Teach. This is where the Teach versus fact came from. It's a misprint in the paper and repeated by Charles Johnson, and he became Edward Teach ever since. There it is, Teach. But he also says, formerly sailed mate out of this port. Was Blackbeard from Philadelphia? Well, he probably actually wasn't from Philadelphia, but may have sailed there many times in his career as an honest seaman, because apparently many of the captives he took recognized him from when they had known him in port before. He certainly knew the waters all around Philadelphia. Now, from there, they sailed all around the outer islands to just to the east of Martinique, where they had tremendous luck. They captured a French slave ship, La Concorde, and renamed it the Queen Anne's Revenge. Now, why is a slave ship good? Here's a sketch of a contemporary slave ship of the day. You notice there's a lot of room below deck for people to sleep. That's important when you're a pirate ship. You need places for up to 300 pirates to make berth. Plus, slave ships were big, well-armed, and they were fast. They were especially designed fast to get across the ocean quickly so that the minimal amount of their cargo would die. Big, fast, with lots of room to stay below deck is ideal for a pirate ship. So anytime a pirate could get his hands on a slave ship, they did. So what happened to all the slaves? Many of them actually joined Blackbeard's crew. In fact, later on, it was considered that 40% of Blackbeard's crew were of African descent. And normally among pirates, those slaves were given totally equal treatment, equal opportunity employers, with the same shares and the same opportunity to advance into leadership roles aboard the ship. So let's talk a little bit about the real Blackbeard. Normally, as I said, he was very kind to his prisoners. What Blackbeard would do when he took a ship is he would invite all of the captives below deck to his ship, and he'd play cards with them, give them rum. People are a lot easier to rob when they're drunk and happy, and Blackbeard wanted them to feel at ease so they would not resist his pirates. He only sank one ship, the Protestant Caesar. That's a ship that ran from him in the Bay of Honduras. They were so terrified that when they got near an island, the entire crew of the ship jumped overboard and swam to the island. Blackbeard was kind of annoyed at this, so in retribution, he burned the ship to the waterline, but no one was hurt. And yes, he did have a very large black beard. Contemporary accounts describe his black beard, which was unusual for the day. Most people were clean shaven. It was very, very unusual for a pirate to have any facial hair whatsoever. So this feature stood out. And you notice those burning matches that would create a smoke, a cloudy smoke around his head. Yes, that is actually well documented too, perhaps to make him a little bit more fierce and intimidating. Blackbeard's whole game was to get people to surrender without a fight. The more intimidating he could become, the easier that was. So in November, between November 1717 and April, he sailed along the Caribbean, taking prizes as he went, and did his loop through the Gulf of Honduras, where he decided to keep one of the sloops named Adventure. Then eventually he sailed around Cuba and took a small Spanish sloop, which he also decided to keep. They just called that ship the Small Spanish Sloop. Meanwhile, back in England, the king had given a proclamation offering pardon to all pirates. You see, England and Spain were about to go to war again, and the king knew he needed to augment his navy with a large privateer crew. So, as was the tradition, he would offer a pardon to every pirate. Come in, take the pardon, and now you can legally become a privateer for me. There were two provisions in this proclamation that were important. First, you must accept it by September 1718. Well, this was April 1718. No problem there. I've got plenty of time to accept that pardon, Blackbeard must have thought. But then you must not have committed any acts of piracy after the 5th of January, 1718. Oops. Blackbeard had just taken all those ships in Honduras. Clearly, he did not qualify to accept this king's pardon, but perhaps nobody will know that he took those ships. Then in May 1718, Blackbeard did something absolutely astounding. The historians have been arguing about this for 300 years. You see, he had stopped off in Nassau on his way and knew about the king's pardon. Then he sailed to Charlestown, South Carolina, blockaded the port for a week, and took 10 to 12 vessels. Why would he do that? If he was going to accept the king's pardon, why would he make an overt act of piracy in the largest English port in the South? He also demanded a chest of medicine, which people find confusing. They speculated that perhaps there was a lot of disease, maybe venereal disease, on board his ship, and he needed treatment right away. But this also troubled me, because those 10 ships that he took did not carry cargo of hardly any value. Most of their cargo was logwood and tar and other construction materials. And if he really needed medicine that bad, he must have had a fortune. Why didn't he just stop in port and buy some? Would have been a lot easier. Historians have dismissed this as Blackbeard either being stubborn or insane or on a power trip or something. I think there's another explanation, which I'm about to get. Then, after he left Charlestown, he sailed the Queen Anne's Revenge to Topsail Inlet and sank it. Another astounding act. Why rob Charlestown and then sink your main ship? I think there's a very interesting explanation that is not in my book, but because I actually think of it until a couple months ago when I was preparing this presentation for the Ollie. Here's my guess. Charlestown was a diversion for his crew. You see, Blackbeard wanted to downscale. He knew he was going to sink the Queen Anne's Revenge and split up with his crew of 300. But he didn't want to share his treasure. He must have had an enormous amount of treasure. He had about 25 loyal pirates. He was happy with sharing the treasure with them. So how do you do 300 pirates out of their fair share? You sink it and say, oh, sorry, the treasure sank with the Queen Anne's Revenge. Too bad, we're all out of luck. But then he would have been out of the treasure too. So he would have to have hidden that treasure somewhere along the way, someplace where he could have recovered it. Well, you can't just sneak all that treasure off your ship with all the rest of the pirates around. But you can if they're in town attacking Charlestown. So I believe now that Blackbeard sailed to Charlestown, had his entire crew busy taking ships of no value and going ashore and drinking and terrorizing the city, while a quiet group of loyal pirates snuck away with the treasure and sailed one day's sailing south to Fripp Island, where they buried the treasure in secrecy. Fripp Island has long had a tradition that Blackbeard's pirate treasure has been buried there. In fact, stories about Blackbeard's treasure being buried on Fripp Island goes back at least to 1800. People were talking about it in 1900. No one's ever found anything, because I believe Blackbeard actually went back and got it after he sank the Queen Anne's Revenge. But I believe he actually did bury the treasure on Fripp Island. And who knows, some of it may still be there. Today, you really can't look for it because Fripp Island is a gated community with a lot of upscale residents. I believe Sylvester Stallone has a house there. So access to the islands is severely limited, but legend is a legend. So after he left Charlestown, as I said, he went to Topsail Inlet and sank the Queen Anne's Revenge. There she goes. Then the adventure actually sinks trying to get the Queen Anne's Revenge off the sandbar. Stede Bonnet gets fed up, getting done out of his share of the treasure, and leaves in his ship Revenge to continue piracy elsewhere. And then Blackbeard takes that small Spanish sloop and renames it the Adventure, and sails to Bath and accepts the pardon from the governor, Charles Eden. Now, at that time, Bath was the capital of North Carolina and the residence of the colony's governor, Governor Charles Eden. Why would Charles Eden issue him a pardon? I mean, news of Charlestown must have reached Bath. It's very close by. Charles Johnson suggests that Blackbeard intimidated the governor and forced him into giving him the pardon. Not likely. Blackbeard had 25 pirates in a very small sloop, a very unimpressive lot, not the kind of group to intimidate Governor Eden. No, the explanation lies somewhere else. Then after he gets the pardon, he sails to the island of Ocracoke, where he makes a small pirate base. Now let's talk about who Blackbeard really was. We talked about Edward Teach. And according to Charles Johnson, Edward Teach originally came from Jamaica. Then in the second edition, he revised that and said he was born in Bristol and moved to Jamaica, where he started his career as a privateer. Well, we know that his real name was Edward Thatch. And surprisingly, there is a Thatch family that came from Bristol and settled in Jamaica in the 1690s. A man by the name of Edward Thatch Sr., who had a son named Edward Thatch Jr., who joined the Royal Navy. That sounds perfect. That's him. That's got to be him. That's Charles Johnson got it right. Maybe misspelled the name, but the story is essentially correct. But that story doesn't explain Stede Bonnet, and it doesn't explain Charles Eden. There's another theory, however, that does. But his name was not Edward Thatch, but it's actually Edward Beard. Interesting pun there. You think about Blackbeard. A lot of times pirates took the name Black with their name, like Black Sam Bellamy, Black Bart. His real name was Edward Beard, then taking the title Blackbeard would have been clever. He may have even grown the beard just to support his nickname. So who was Edward Beard? He was the son of James Beard. James Beard was a wealthy plantation owner that lived in Bath, North Carolina, on property next door to Governor Charles Eden, and was friends with the governor. That would certainly explain the Governor Eden. What if Governor Eden was granting him that pardon because, well, he was the son of his old friend? Then James Beard also had a brother who would have been Blackbeard's uncle, who worked for the Bonnets over in Barbados. Blackbeard may have even come from Barbados as a child. I can imagine, and this is speculation, that young Edward Beard and Stede Bonnet may have been childhood friends playing together in the backyard. Perhaps that's why Stede Bonnet sought out his friend. Well, what about the real Edward Thatch? Well, if you're Edward Beard and you decide you want to be a pirate, you need to change your name to save the reputation of your family members that are still living in North Carolina. You need to assume an alias. Perhaps the real Edward Thatch and the real Edward Beard sailed together on a ship. Maybe Edward Thatch died at sea. That would be a perfect identity for him to assume. He could easily take the name Edward Thatch, knowing a lot of details about the real Edward Thatch, and no one would be able to trace him as Edward Beard. I think this theory is very likely. Now, what about Stede Bonnet? He continued as a pirate, but he renamed his ship the Royal James, another Jacobite supporter. But he wasn't very successful. He was captured off of Cape Fear and taken to Charlestown, South Carolina to stand trial for piracy, where a few months later, he was hanged below the low water mark. Interesting thing about jurisdiction. Pirates had to be executed over the water because they committed their crimes over the water. So when you hung a pirate, it had to be either from a ship or on a dock over the water, or if you really had to hang a pirate at land, you had to hang him at low tide below the high water mark. You would wheel a cart out into the mucky marsh and hang him there, and then when the water came in, well, you've met the requirements. He was executed above the sea. Back to Blackbeard. In August 1718, Blackbeard sails to Marcus Hook, Pennsylvania, a small community just south of Philadelphia. We know he was there because the governor of Pennsylvania issued a warrant for his arrest. All right, what about Marcus Hook? Marcus Hook was one of those pirate-friendly ports. When most of the big pirate-friendly ports dried up in around 1705, Marcus Hook emerged as the new place where pirates could go and secretly sell their merchandise. Why? Marcus Hook was settled by the Quakers. Now, the Quakers were a very forgiving lot. They were also good businessmen and didn't really like to pay the royalties to the crown on merchandise they purchased and all the tariffs. So anytime they could buy merchandise duty and tax-free, they were all about that. This is a map of the actual city of Marcus Hook, and you'll see an avenue called Discord Lane, where the Quakers allowed taverns to be built, and the pirates were welcome in port as long as they stayed at Discord Lane and didn't bother the harmony of the rest of the community. And for about 20 years, Marcus Hook operated that way. They must have made a fortune. And the pirates were actually well behaved because they didn't want to spoil a good thing. Now, according to local legend, Blackbeard had a girlfriend that lived at Marcus Hook. That is exactly where her house was. In fact, still is. This is the house today. Originally built in 1706, local legend says that his girlfriend lived there and Blackbeard would visit her every time he came to Marcus Hook. The local legend continued on for about 200 years afterwards, with all of the local residents telling stories that their grandparents and their great-grandparents had passed on to them about Blackbeard being there and walking the streets wearing his sword, but a very nice fellow. Then after visiting his girlfriend, he took his sloop Adventure and sailed to the Bermudas, where he captured 2 French merchant ships. Well, he had just accepted the pardon. Well, maybe they'll overlook that. Then sailed back to his base on Ocracoke. Now, this was a made-to-order scandal for the governor of Virginia, seen on the left there, Governor Spotswood. You see, Governor Spotswood was of the opposite political party as Governor Eden. And if he could involve the governor in a scandal with pirates, his party could remove the governor from office and take over. Things don't change much, do they? Politics are the same in the 17th century as they are in the 21st century. Anyway, Governor Spotswood hatched a plan to implicate Governor Eden with Blackbeard, but first, Blackbeard would have to be arrested. That task fell to Lieutenant Robert Maynard, the most passed over officer in the Royal Navy, whose base was at Hampton, Virginia, very close to where the governor resided. Now, he was an ideal choice. If he failed, then all the blame could be thrown to him. Oh, well, he acted irrationally without authorization, because going into North Carolina from Virginia was illegal. The Virginia had no authority in the colony of North Carolina. But on the other hand, if he succeeded, he was too junior of an officer to take any credit, and the credit would go to his captain. So there's Blackbeard at his island on Ocracoke, where he was quietly taking all of the rest of the cargo off of the French ships that he had recently taken. There he is right there. Oh, by the way, some of that cargo taken off of the French ships found its way into Governor Eden's basement, but perhaps that's a coincidence. And then Lieutenant Robert Maynard appears with two civilian sloops that they had rented to approach Blackbeard. It grew dark, and the beacon light on the lighthouse island shone. It was the only light there. Now, Blackbeard would have seen the two sloops, but wouldn't have been alarmed. That was a dangerous incident, and ships arriving there at night often dropped anchor and waited for daylight to make their way through the passage. So as far as Blackbeard was concerned, partying with 15 of his men aboard his ship, they were just two merchants quietly waiting out the evening. In the morning, though, the two sloops started heading straight towards Blackbeard. He became alarmed, and he threw them a hail, asking who they were, and they said, "It was you we're after." And Blackbeard then realized exactly who they were. He ordered his gunner to open fire, and the battle began. Now, the Battle of Ocracoke moved at a speed that one might say is between slow and stop. There was almost no wind. There was almost no current. The crew had to row their vessels towards each other. They would run aground on a sandbar and get free and move 10 more feet, and run aground on another sandbar and move another 10 feet. So for hours, these two ships slowly made their way towards each other, firing shots back and forth without doing too much damage. Eventually, the two ships were close enough where Blackbeard's men could pour aboard Maynard's vessel. But Maynard's men, most of them who were hiding below decks, sprung up, and hand-to-hand battle ensued. It was said that a Scotsman struck Blackbeard in the neck with his sword. Blackbeard said, "Well done, lad." And the Scotsman said, "Well, if it wasn't well done, I'll do it again," and took another swing, cutting off Blackbeard's head. At any rate, after a few minutes, all of Blackbeard's crew were dead or captured. Blackbeard's head was hung on the bowsprit of the ship, where they sailed back to Hampton. And according to legend, Blackbeard's head was placed on a spike at the entrance to the port of Hampton for 2 years as a warning to other pirates. Newspapers all over the European and American continent literally exploded with the sensational news of female pirates being captured. Those, of course, were Anne Bonny and Mary Read. Think of it. Story about two females living in sin with a crew of men, attacking other ships, capturing and threatening other men. It's a great story. It's got everything. It's got sex, it's got scandal, it's got adventure, it's got literally any story that a newspaperman would want to tell. And all of the tabloids and major newspapers went after the story tooth and nail. This was the #1 story for months, and Anne Bonny and Mary Read, for a short time, became the two most famous women of their day. But in talking about Anne Bonny and Mary Read, it's very difficult to separate the myth from the truth, partly there again because of Charles Johnson. So we'll try to do that. Now, we know that they both sailed with Calico Jack Rackham, who was a real pirate. He was one of those Nassau pirates back from the good old days. He had been friends with Blackbeard. He had been quartermaster under another pirate named Charles Vane. If you've watched the TV series Black Sails, you'll know Calico Jack Rackham and Charles Vane very well, real people. And now he was operating as a small-time pirate out of Nassau when he met Anne Bonny and Mary Read, and operated somewhere on the south waters of Cuba. Woodes Rogers had heard about this, and he was outraged because a short time earlier, Calico Jack Rackham accepted the king's pardon, and now apparently had gone back on his word. Woodes Rogers would not tolerate that, so he sent pirate hunter Jonathan Barnett out specifically to take Calico Jack Rackham. He was anchored quietly off the north shore of Jamaica on October 1720, when Jonathan Barnett's sloop appeared. He immediately recognized that it was Jack Rackham's ship and headed straight for it. There was no question in any of Jack Rackham's crew's mind what was about to happen. The men surrendered quietly, but not the women. They sprung into action, fighting like wildcats, firing their pistols, wielding swords, attacking all of Jonathan Barnett's men. It took his entire crew to subdue them and tie them up. Meanwhile, Calico Jack Rackham and his male crew surrendered without a fight. They were taken to Port Royal, the capital of the island, where they were held in that building. That is an actual photograph that I took in what is now called Spanish Town of the government building, which at the time was used to hold any type of prisoners. Now, eventually, Jack Rackham and his entire crew were hanged, except for the two females. What about Anne Bonny and Mary Read? They pled their bellies. You see, apparently both of them were pregnant. And you can't execute a pregnant woman because you would be killing an innocent child. And you didn't really keep people in prison back in those days. You were either hanged or released. Since hanging wasn't an option, they were released. Now, Mary Read unfortunately died before she was released because she's buried in the church graveyard in Jamaica. She wouldn't have been buried there as a pirate because she would have been condemned. But if she still had her child with her, her child would have been buried there. So it is estimated that Mary Read probably died in childbirth. But Anne Bonny disappeared into the veiled mysteries of history. No one has any idea of what happened to her. Now I'll talk a little bit about grog. Everybody has heard about grog, famous drink. But if I asked you what the recipe for grog was, I'd probably get about 20 or 30 different answers. Everyone has their own formula for making the traditional naval drink. Here's the original one. And it comes from Admiral Edward Vernon of the Royal Navy. He was one of the most respected and competent admirals of all time. A captain all through the war for the Spanish Succession, was well respected and well liked. And he had the nickname of Old Grog. He got that name because he wore a coat made out of grogram wool. Now, grogram was a cheap blend of kind of a wool and silk type of blend, but it wasn't very expensive cloth. It was kind of like the Walmart of material cloth at the time. And where admirals always wore fancy, expensive clothing and common people wore grogram, he wore grogram just like the crew. This endeared him to them. He was one of the guys. So he was called Old Grog with great affection. But he had a problem. You see, they gave a rum ration to all of the sailors on board. Now, that creates a lot of your crew being drunk, which is a bad thing. Plus, if they drank the water, they got sick because the water was very nasty on those ships. So they didn't drink the water, they just drank the rum. Now they were dehydrated. And on top of that, they got scurvy, and no one knew what caused that. But Old Grog got an idea. He took the water and he mixed it with the rum. All right, that's good because the rum purifies the water and makes it safe to drink. And the water dilutes the rum so you don't get quite as drunk when you're drinking it. And then he added some sugar. Well, let's make it taste nice because that water is pretty nasty out of those old casks. And for a special little bit of flavor, let's add lime juice. And that was the drink he came up with, rum. Kind of a mojito without the mint. Well, his crew were very healthy. The lime prevented scurvy, even though they didn't know it. The rum purified the water so they didn't get sick. They drank the grog so they didn't get dehydrated. And pretty soon, grog was ordered to be served among all British naval vessels. In fact, that's where the Americans started calling the British sailors limeys because of the lime juice mixed in grog. Now back to the action. The Caribbean was becoming less and less profitable. There were a lot more Royal Navy ships looking for pirates. There were a lot more pirate hunters looking for pirates. So the interest seemed to turn to the west coast of Africa. There were huge amounts of riches that could be taken from the slave trading forts there. And there weren't too many pirate hunters over on the coast. Slave trading forts were all over the coast, and they were well defended. So you would have to be a very clever pirate in order to knock off a post like that. But ships coming and going from the port may have been a little bit easier to take. Here's a map of James Island Fort. You can see just how well built these slave trading forts were. Enter Hal Davis. Now, Hal Davis was an honest seaman and navigator on a slave ship headed towards one of those slaving trading posts when he was captured by pirates. They offered him a berth on board their ship. That was usual then. When pirates would take a ship, they would say, "Who wants to join?" And anybody that wanted to join was allowed to. If you didn't want to join, well, that's okay. Then you're allowed to go about your business. Well, in Hal Davis's case, he refused. So he was let go. He was given the ship and sailed back towards the port on Barbados. But when he got there and explained what had happened, the authorities didn't believe him. They thought that he had sold off his cargo and kept the profits for himself and turned pirate. So they threw him in jail. A few months later, they realized that that wasn't the case, so they released him. But his reputation was ruined, and no one would hire him as a navigator. A few months later, he wound up in the Bahamas looking for a job and took a job as a lowly seaman aboard a small sloop called the Buck. Well, he had had enough of the treatment, and he met a few other seamen that some of them had actually been pirates, down on their luck, and decided, let's turn to piracy. So they overwhelmed the crew of the Buck and sailed out from the Bahamas for the west coast of Florida as pirates. Along the way, he spotted a fairly large French merchant ship. Now, the only thing I can say about Hal Davis is if Jack Sparrow were a real person, he would be Hal Davis. Charismatic, bright, clever, very imaginative, and down and out great guy, good to everybody. He was actually got the title the Cavalier, the Prince of Pirates, well deserved. And his first action as captain explains how clever he was. He easily took this French ship that was very poorly armed, and while looting it, saw a much larger French merchant ship coming right towards him. Well, this is bad. If he stays there to reap the treasure of the prize he just took, he will be easily outgunned by this huge French ship. Even if he tries to run now, by the time he got his sails up, that French ship would be upon him and he would be blown out of the water. What's he going to do? Thinking fast, he gave unloaded guns to all of the crew of the French ship, and his pirates stood around with their hands up in the air. The large French merchant ship, looking through their spyglass, assumed that the French merchant ship had captured the pirate ship. Well done! We're going to sail to your aid. And they sailed right up to Hal Davis's vessel, totally unaware. Then his pirates pulled out their real weapons and overwhelmed the large ship in no time. From there, he sailed towards the coast of Africa. But taking another ship, which he kept naming the Royal James. There it is again, a Jacobite supporter. Then as approaching the coast of Africa, he sighted another ship. Well, he was just getting ready for battle, and he raised his pirate flag. When the other ship raised its pirate flag too. Oh, well, we didn't know you were pirates. Heave to, and let's talk a bit. So the pirates joined forces and became friends. The pirate he had just met was Labousse. That is the same pirate that had temporarily been partners of Blackbeard and Ben Hornigold way back in the Caribbean days. His real name was Oliver Levasseur, and he was a French privateer that generally sailed for the English. Now, he has a very unusual flag. It was a white flag with a black skeleton, the only white pirate flag of the day. So they reached the fort, James Island Fort. But how do you take that? There again, Hal Davis was very clever. He dressed as a merchant and flew a merchant flag, a Dutch merchant flag, and sailed into port and asked to meet with the governor. Explained that he and his crew were wealthy merchants looking to buy lots of slaves and perhaps invest a little bit in the colony. The governor was thrilled and invited everyone to dinner. Hal Davis and his crew of well-selected men of maybe 20 went to dinner, and at a certain wink from Hal Davis, pulled out their weapons and took everybody hostage. Meanwhile, the exact same moment, his crew attacked the sentries of the main gate unawares and seized the fort. The governor gave him an enormous ransom, and Hal Davis sailed out of port, a wealthy man without loss of life. Well, the pirate partnership was soon to dissolve. Labousse just wasn't the kind of guy Hal Davis was. Labousse was a little bit more abusive towards his captives, a little bit rougher, and so eventually they decided to part ways. But it was a friendly parting. Now let's talk about command structure. Normally, at this time period, captains were elected by the crew. They could be voted out of office at any time. And captains only had total authority during battle. The rest of the time, they was just a regular member of the crew. Normally, the captain was selected captain because they could navigate. So certainly, when they weren't in battle, the captain was navigating, but not giving any orders until a prize ship was sighted. That responsibility fell to the quartermaster, the number 2 in charge. He ran the crew, was responsible for their conduct and their discipline, and when not in battle, was actually in charge of the vessel, and would relinquish command to the captain as soon as the ship was sighted. That was for normal pirates, but Hal Davis invented a totally unique command structure, which he called his House of Lords. He had 5 very loyal pirates that formed this House of Lords and would make all the decisions sort of in a vote, like Parliament. The rest of the crew had no say. If the rest of the crew, known as the House of Commons, in a majority vote wanted to make a decision, then they were allowed to, but only if a majority vote of the crew demanded them have the right to make a decision. This was a very efficient way of running the ship because you didn't have to involve everyone with easy decisions of the day. Hal Davis continued taking prizes all along Africa, and then off of Sierra Leone took another fort, and then sailed further along and took another slave ship. And on this slave ship was a young navigator named John Roberts. So, John Roberts. Now, John Roberts was the navigator on this ship that he had just taken, and he was Welsh. Well, Hal Davis was Welsh too. So, over the next couple of days, while they were looting the ship, Hal Davis and John Roberts became very close friends. And John Roberts decided, yeah, I'd like to be a pirate. I'll join your crew, and signed aboard. The next stop was the island of Principe. And true to form, Hal Davis decided to use the plan that had worked twice before. Claim to be a merchant, come to dinner, and then take the island. Unfortunately, he was recognized, and the governor was warned. So the governor set up an ambush for Hal Davis and his party, and as they walked to the palace to accept their dinner invitations, they were all killed. His crew was outraged. They attacked the city and did as much damage as they could, and then sailed off to figure out what to do next. Who would replace Hal Davis as captain? Well, there's a lot of political power struggle among the crew for this position, but you also had to be a navigator. None of them could really navigate except one man, the newest member of the crew, a man that had only been on board for 9 days. That was John Roberts. So John Roberts was elected the new captain, a man with no political connections to anyone, the ideal replacement, they thought, for Hal Davis. New flag was in order, and there he is, the pirate captain toasting and drinking with the devil, a skeleton holding a spear. Very unique flag. So as new captain, John Roberts ordered the ship to sail to the coast of Brazil and the very rich port of Salvador. Now, when they arrived, they found the port filled with treasure ships and guarded by 2 very large Portuguese ships of war. Everybody said, oh, that's just too much. We can't do anything with that port. And they were shocked when Roberts said, we're going to take it. Sail straight ahead. He was the captain, and his orders had to be obeyed. So Roberts crept in quietly at night, as if he was just another merchant ship arriving and wanting to lay anchor. And he captured a small pilot vessel, took the pilot on board, and said, guard me to the most richest prize ship out of all of these. And the captain did. He weaved his way through all of the ships laying at anchor at about 2 in the morning and came alongside the other ship. Once alongside, boom, let off with a broadside. Then he threw his grappling hooks and pulled the 2 ships together. His crew swept over the decks of the sleeping merchant ship that had just awoken to the sound of gun blasts hurling through their wood. In a few moments, it was all over. Roberts had captured the ship. But now what he was going to do, how was he going to get away? I mean, those 2 huge big warships at the bottom of the screen had heard the gun blasts and were making ready to sail. Roberts knew he didn't have time to unload the treasure, so he merely tied up the other ship in tow and sailed out of the harbor before the other ships could get underway. And over the horizon, that daring move made him one of the most successful and famous pirates of the day. His crew loved him, and they headed towards Devil's Island. That's the same Devil's Island as later on the famous French prison camp was. But back in those days, it was a pirate-friendly port where pirates could go and spend their money in taverns and whatever else pirates wanted to do. Now, one of the things that he got from that huge treasure fleet was a ruby and diamond encrusted cross, shown in the picture there. He is said to have worn that cross till his dying day. In fact, when he was killed finally by the British, he was still wearing that cross when they recovered his body. So Roberts sailed his ship, the Royal Rover, up and found a new ship. He captured it and decided to keep it, called the Fortune. And the main Royal Rover, with all of his treasure, went back to Devil's Island in order to unload the treasure and have a good time. We'll see you in town. Meanwhile, he had gotten word that another very rich merchant ship was due in any moment. So he decided to stay on the Fortune and take it. But it would have to be a fast ship. And in order to be fast, he ordered all the casks of water to be thrown overboard. Now he's going to catch that other ship. Problem is, the other ship never showed, and the wind stopped. And for 8 days, he was stranded, motionless in the water, with nothing to drink. His crew was on the verge of dying of thirst. Something had to be done. He puts the men in a rowboat and rowed back to Devil's Island for help. When they arrived, there was no one there. All of his compadres had left him with the treasure. This was an event that started the setup actions in Robert's mind that would lead him to become one of the cruelest, most vicious pirates of his day. He wrote new articles, tearing up Hal Davis's old House of Lords and command structure. And under his new articles, he was in total authority all the time, not just when they were at battle, but every second of the day. The governors of Martinique and Barbados were aware of Roberts and his actions and decided, we're not going to tolerate a pirate here. So they sent pirate hunters out deliberately to look for Roberts and to take him. Roberts found out about this and became infuriated. He decided that he's going to take an oath to kill personally both of those governors and designed a new flag. You see, there's Roberts standing on two skulls, Bahamas head, Martinique head. In other words, he's standing on the skulls of the two governors of the provinces that most annoyed him. Now, as I said, he was on his way to becoming one of the cruelest pirates known to man. They're known to on the Caribbean. This is true. He had total authority as a pirate captain, and pretty soon he was very harsh to captives, torturing, killing, burning their ships, burning ports. He became the typical Hollywood version of a pirate captain, well-dressed in fancy clothes, total authority, everyone terrified. In fact, there was an incident where one man was too slow climbing up the rigging, so Roberts pulled out his pistol and shot him. The crew was terrified of him. This is where he got the name, the Great Pirate Roberts. Well, the Royal Navy decided, we're going to stop this. And they sent 20 ships to the Caribbean specifically to look for Roberts. Getting too hot there. So Roberts decided to sail north, taking a few prizes along the way. He reached Nova Scotia in August of 1720 and attacked 3 major ports there, taking 210 vessels. But even though he held the ports for ransom and the people paid, before leaving, he burned the ports to the ground. He sank ships even though they had peacefully surrendered and given him all his treasure. Roberts had crossed the line from what was acceptable behavior for pirates and had become a menace to the world. One of the ships that he took, he kept, a 22-gun brigantine named the Royal Fortune. The British got word that Roberts was in Nova Scotia and sent the fleet up to catch him. At the same time, Roberts was sailing south, right back to his old stomping waters. and they passed without seeing each other. He continued taking prizes all around the Lesser Antilles, keeping a new ship, now a 44-gun brigantine, which he named the Royal Fortune. In fact, he named all of his ships the Royal Fortune. The great pirate Roberts, as he was known in the press, was now public enemy number one. Every ship in the Royal Navy was out to get him. The water was a little too hot in the Caribbean, so he decided to return to Africa and see if his luck would be any better there. Approaching Gambia, taking a few ships along the way, he decided to keep them. Now he has a 3-ship fleet. And he attacked the same fort that Hal Davis had attacked before. Well, Hal Davis's trick didn't work this time, but he didn't need to. Roberts had the guts to go in with guns blazing and demand a ransom, and was successful. Meanwhile, 2 Royal Navy ships were hot on his trail, the HMS Swallow and the HMS Weymouth. They were sure that they were going to catch Roberts soon. Roberts continued taking prizes all along the African coast, and then blockaded the slave trading port of Ouidah. Ouidah was the largest of all of the slave trading ports on the west coast of Africa, selling as many as 1,000 slaves a week. The Ouidah port itself did not belong to any European nation. It was an independent African nation managed by an African king that established a slave trade for his nation. But it was certainly the richest prize anyone would be able to take. There's the port of Ouidah with a lot of ships in there, and there's Roberts with his 3 ships. Now, instead of going in and attacking, he decided to blockade the port and demand a ransom from each ship leaving. It seems a little bit easier to do than to try and take on all of those guns. And he demanded that each ship pay him a ransom of 8 pounds of gold dust, and they can sail along their way unmolested, which all of the ships did, by the way. And Roberts, being an efficient captain, decided to offer a receipt. You pay your ransom, you get a receipt that you can show to one of his other ships if stopped, proving that you've paid the gold dust to him. Now, you'll notice how he signs this receipt. Bat Roberts. That's what led people to think his name was Bartholomew. Well, everybody knew it was John, but he signed that receipt Bat. So, for some unknown reason, he must have changed his name to Bartholomew Roberts. That's what Johnson assumed. And therefore, he got the name Black Bart. This is totally incorrect. You see, what they didn't realize is Bat, B-A-T-T, was a nickname for a Welshman. He was very proud of being Welsh. So when he signed those receipts, Bat Roberts, he was really signing it Welshman Roberts. No, his name was nothing but John Roberts the whole time. From there, he sailed to Annobon Island, small, uninhabited island. He needed to careen his vessels, and he thought that was about the safest spot. But meanwhile, the HMS Swallow was hot on his trail. The captain pulled into Principe just a few days after he left. Now he believed he could catch Roberts. He knew just where he was going. February 5th, 1722. 2 of Roberts' ships were careening on the beach. You see him laying on the side there, with the smallest vessel standing guard. And the HMS Swallow started approaching. But just as he got close, the winds changed direction and forced his ship away. Well, at first, he thought this was terrible, but Roberts saw this and assumed it was a merchant ship that recognized him and was trying to escape. So instead of Roberts thinking, well, this is the Royal Navy coming to do battle, thought, this is a merchant ship and I'm not going to let him get away. So he got one of his vessels operational and sailed out after him. Now, the captain of the Swallow couldn't believe his luck. Here was a pirate ship pursuing him by itself over the horizon, away from the sight of Roberts and the other ships. When the two vessels got close by, the HMS Swallow opened up with a broadside, then another. And pretty soon, the small pirate vessel was devastated with cannon shot and easily captured. Meanwhile, Roberts had taken another merchant ship and was very occupied taking all of the treasure off that vessel when the HMS Swallow returned. There again, the captain could not believe his luck. He could creep in as close as possible and Roberts wouldn't notice. And that's exactly what happened. When the Swallow got close to Roberts' ship, he let go with a large broadside. The first round killed Roberts. A large battle ensued, but very quickly Roberts and his crew were overcome, with the result of 3 pirates being dead and 152 captured, which were taken back to Principe to stand trial for piracy, along with their articles, logbooks, and most of what we know about pirates' lifestyle came from those 152 captured pirates that gave detailed testimony in their trial. John Roberts was the last of the great pirates of the golden age of piracy. With his death, the golden age comes to a close. Certainly there was a lot of piracy, but not like before. It was all low-key, quiet, small-time operations below the visibility of the Royal Navy, and there would never be privateer letters issued again. The Royal Navy was finished with privateers and pirates and decided to make their Navy the largest of all time. This is when the Royal Navy became the Royal Navy we think of, and by 1744 was the most powerful naval force on the seas. And what about Labuse? Well, remember Labuse had separated from Hal Davis way back several years ago off the coast of Africa, and he sailed around the Cape of Good Hope into the Indian Ocean, where he and his ship Victory, a galley of 30 guns, operated very successfully for about 9 years. He captured a ship called Nasibora. Nasi Senora, it was one of the largest treasure ships ever found. Well armed with 72 guns. I'll skip ahead a lot, make it fast. And eventually, by 1730, it is estimated he had $5 billion in treasure. But he was captured and taken to Reunion Island to stand trial for piracy. While he was on the gallows, he threw a necklace with an encrypted message into the crowd, shouting, there he goes, "Find my treasure for he who may understand." That's the encrypted message. And for 300 years, people have been trying to decipher it to find out where his $5 billion worth of treasure may be concealed. With that, I'm going to stop the class. Thank you so much.